Should energy firms be allowed to force struggling customers onto prepayment meters? Why are low traffic neighbourhoods so controversial? And what is going on with the SNP? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Siobhan Bailey, Labour's Liz Kendall, the SNP Stuart Hosey and the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole. Today, the SNP Treasurer, Colin Beattie, has been arrested by police investigating the party's finances. This comes as Scotland's First Minister prepares to set out his priorities for government this afternoon.
Humza Yousaf has a big problem. The continuity candidate, that's why he got elected 2 weeks ago, and it's now hanging around his neck like an albatross.
We'll ask this senior SNP frontbencher just how much trouble the party's in.
Everyone I'm talking to within the fostering sector is saying recruitment has never been this hard. Right now, people are looking at the money and going, I can't afford to do this.
The number of foster carers is falling, so should they get paid parental leave?
This is probably Britain's most abused bollard. It's been repeatedly run over, bent, battered, beaten, even burnt.
Why do these low traffic neighbourhoods make some people so angry? Let's start today's programme with a discussion about prepayment meters. I think we can show you a headline here in The Independent. Forced installation of prepayment meters to be banned for over 85s. Now, the forced installation of those prepayment meters had been temporarily halted after undercover footage emerged of homes being broken into by big gas companies with court warrants. Now, energy companies are going to be able to resume those forced installations, but there are going to be restrictions, a new code of conduct, although it is voluntary. So my question to the panel, starting with you, Siobhan, is should it be banned altogether? Forced installation in the homes of vulnerable people?
Listen, I think the Times investigation, the undercover investigation, completely blew the lid off some very sharp and quite horrid practice, actually, for some very vulnerable people. So I've seen the Secretary of State has come out this morning and said that the announcements and the new code is a great first step, and Ofcom is going to be consulting on whether it should be mandatory.
Right.
But I think there is not an energy supplier in this country that doesn't know how serious this is. What I'd like to see them do is, with their workforce that goes into homes, is give some compassion, give some common sense guidance, give some training, because it's not rocket science. You go into a house and you see a mum with a 4-week-old baby who's living in poverty. Yeah. You shouldn't be turning off her energy. So
should it be mandatory then?
Well, I think that's for Ofcom to go through the consultation. I mean, nothing in Westminster happens without a blooming consultation, so I'm not surprised that that is the first step. But as the Secretary of State says, he's pleased about this. He's already read the Riot Act on this.
Liz, what do you think? Should it be made mandatory? Because despite what Siobhan has said, there might be occasions when good practice is not followed. In fact, the Ofgem boss, Jonathan Brearley, said he can't guarantee there will be no bad practice.
I don't think this goes far enough. It shouldn't just be for the over 85s. There's a whole group, including parents with young children, those with Alzheimer's, people who've been recently bereaved, what Ofgem calls medium risk, but actually is quite, I think, a vulnerable group, and that should be banned for those group, and it should be mandatory.
And would you go further than that? Other groups?
I don't think it should be a banned right across the board. Some people want to have prepayment meters, but this hasn't gone far enough. And I would also say here, let's not forget the root cause of the problem here, which is our energy costs are too high. And that ultimately is what we need to see tackled, and we haven't seen enough from that from the government yet.
What's your view, Stuart? Should it go further? Should it first be mandatory, and should it include more groups of vulnerable people?
It should go much, much further. Listen, we know that large numbers of people who are in poverty are also in work. We know that, and we know that electricity and gas prices have gone through the roof. You know, it's not beyond the wit of anyone to imagine somebody working really hard but struggling, can't afford to put money in the meter. The fridge goes off and the insulin needed for themselves or a child is ruined. we've got to be much, much more compassionate. The idea that you can force your way into a house, install one of these prepayment meters, and then switch it off after barely a day or so of emergency supply simply isn't good enough.
Do you think it should be banned altogether, forced installation?
I would certainly ban the forced installation. I think there should be some kind of court order before that was even remotely necessary. I think it's appalling.
The problem is they do have court orders, so
yes,
it's a problem
they have
with
court
the law,
warrants.
not just
Yeah,
the regulator.
yeah.
I think that's the closest to political consensus I've seen in a long time.
Well, enjoy it.
I know,
Enjoy
it while it
embrace
lasts. But it does seem that if even the government representatives and the opposition parties are all basically saying probably not enough, needs to go further, even if it's dressed up as baby steps, I don't really understand quite what Ofgem have been doing on this. They had to be shamed by the press, probably one of the best regulators going, but I would say that. But, you know, it does feel to me a little bit like they've been up too far, up the energy companies, supporting them for too long. There needs to be a long look at regulators in this country. They seem to be doing far too much of the little pointless stuff, and when it comes to big issues like this, they always seem to be found wanting. So regulatory overhaul in this country, long overdue.
Oh, well, let's leave it there and look at the SNP. The BBC News story. This actually happened in the last hour or so. Colin Beattie, police arrest SNP treasurer in finance probe. He was arrested by police earlier today. Now, it comes just 2 weeks after Peter Murrell, the SNP's former chief executive, who is married to Nicola Sturgeon, was also arrested by officers, I think we can see pictures here, who searched his home in Glasgow and the party's headquarters in Edinburgh. Mr Murrell was later released without charge, pending further investigation. And this afternoon, the fairly new First Minister, Humza Yousaf, will set out his priorities for the next 3 years in a statement in Holyrood. Let's speak now to the BBC Scotland political correspondent, Jamie McIver, who is in Edinburgh. Jamie, tell us a little bit more about what happened this morning.
Well, of course, Joe, we're very limited in what we're actually able to say on this kind of story, but Police Scotland said about 9 o'clock this morning that an arrest had been made. I'll talk you through what we can say. Police say the arrest was made in connection with the ongoing investigation into the funding and finances of the SNP, and a report will be made to the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service in due course. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Mr Beattie. He's 71, he's the MSP for Midlothian North and Musselburgh, and he served as the SNP Treasurer for 16 years up to 2020, and then he took the post up again last year. There's no sign of any police activity at his home this morning. Now, of course, 2 weeks ago, police arrested and questioned the former chief executive of the party, Peter Murrell, the husband of Nicola Sturgeon. He was questioned for several hours, then released without charge. And police searched Mr Murrell's home for over the course of 2 days. Those images of the police outside the home were seen not just across Scotland and the UK, but all across the world. But the actual police investigation into SNP finances has been going on for nearly 2 years now. Questions were raised over how some £600,000 spent for an independence referendum campaign was spent. Questions were raised after accounts showed just £97,000 in the bank at the end of 2019 and total assets of about £272,000. But certainly when it comes to the timing today, it's not perhaps what the SNP would regard as helpful when they would want the focus to try to go back onto politics, policies and the aims and objectives of the new First Minister, Humza Yousaf.
Oh, right. Well, thank you very much for that. That's Jamie McIver in Edinburgh. Humza Yousaf is setting out his priorities this afternoon. But actually, there was leaked video footage at the weekend that emerged from March 2021 of Nicola Sturgeon playing down fears about the party's finances at a meeting of the party's ruling National Executive Committee. Let's just take a look.
Just be very careful, all of us, about suggestions that there are problems with the party's finances, because we depend on donors to donate. There are no reasons for people to be concerned about the party's finances, and all of us need to be careful about not suggesting that there is.
Just taking into account what we heard from our correspondent there in Edinburgh, why did Nicola Sturgeon say that about the SNP's finances?
Well, Jamie McIver read out some figures from 2019. Nicola Sturgeon was speaking in 2021, and if you look at the audited accounts on the Electoral Commission website from 2021, you'll see that there were £600,000 worth of reserves. So Nicola was absolutely right, and I've got no reason to doubt today that the finances are in good health.
Right, you have no doubts at all. Because people might say, just what is going on with the SNP? This investigation has been broadly going on for quite some time. And people will say, well, is the party close to bankruptcy, despite what you've said?
Well, no, the party isn't close to bankruptcy. As I say, I've got absolutely no doubt that the party's finances are in good health.
Because you know that, or you've been told that?
That's correct, because I've been told that. I believe that's the case. And, you know, you make an interesting point, and I'm going to also be very careful what I say. Someone has been arrested.
We're not going to talk about specific individuals or specific allegations.
Indeed.
I'm talking
But
broadly
I think this is really important. You know, Jamie McIver, they made the point, this investigation has been going on for 2 years. Nobody has yet been charged with anything. I think the sooner this is brought to a head, whether someone is charged or not, the better, to be brutally honest. It does, however, throw up a slightly larger problem that goes beyond the SNP about political party funding and scrutiny and transparency.
And you can talk to the other parties about that in just a moment. But let's just stick with this issue, because very much in the headlines at the moment. You have no concerns at all, Stuart Hosey. You are not worried about anything to do with the way the party's been run or its finances.
Oh, I'll be really honest. I do not think this is a good look. I will be I will be extremely honest and say there's an awful lot more, as Hamza Yousaf has said, that can be done in terms of transparency for party members, because it's their money mainly, right? And I think that's really important. So yes, there are a large number of things which can be done, which the National Executive have already put in place so that we can deliver the transparency that people want and need from all political parties.
Yes, I mean, I think there are colleagues of yours in the party who feel that they are literally hearing about this in the newspapers, on the airwaves, in headlines. They don't know what's going on. Do you accept that actually the SNP is not being transparent, even with senior members and colleagues of yours?
No, I've just said I think we need to put in place mechanisms which deliver much more transparency. So if someone asks a question about the finances or about membership, they get the answer they need and they get it when they need it.
I mean, looking at the other parties, you might question, Liz Kendall, why Labour aren't doing better in the polls in Scotland, despite all of this being across every single paper pretty well. The SNP are still way ahead of Labour.
Sawa has made significant strides forward here, and this is because the people of Scotland are being let down by two governments, the SNP and the Conservatives. And we hear about, we're going to hear about the priorities of Hamza Yousaf today. I mean, the problem is this. You've got record weights in the NHS, you've got record levels of child poverty, of homelessness, of drug deaths. And Hamza Yousaf was absolutely at the heart of a government that has delivered that. He is the continuity candidate. He has lost sight of the priorities of the people of Scotland because he's so concerned with independence. And look at this issue over the SNP's finances here, a serious issue. You were quoted yesterday saying, oh, this is just a political bubble issue. It is not. People need to trust their government with their taxes, and if they can't trust the SNP with its own money, you're in serious trouble.
Liz,
they need a change. It's time for a change, and it's Labour that's delivering.
That's very interesting, and Labour have been spectacularly incapable of beating the SNP now for over a decade. But if you want to speak about trust and money and party finances, 6 months ago, I think The Guardian were reporting Labour had lost 91,000 members and were £4.8 million in the red. What went so wrong?
Investigated by the police.
What went so wrong, and why is Keir Starmer so bad at managing the finances of the Labour Party and even keeping his own members?
You're being investigated by police. It's a serious issue. I hope it is sorted out as soon as possible. What this shows
to answer the question, though, Liz.
Is a
why were Labour
£5
million in the red?
Stuart, if you let me finish. A culture of secrecy and cover-up. People in Scotland want the government to be focused on their priorities, and I think the divide and the absolute acrimony within the SNP, it actually doesn't surprise me. You base your politics on the politics of division, and you're a divided party, and that is a huge problem for the people of Scotland who desperately need change.
And the problem is Labour now base their politics on the Tory politics of Brexit. In lockstep, red Tories, blue Tories, not a cigarette
Let's see
paper.
when it comes to
between
the
the
election.
parents.
let me
Stuart,
come to
let's see.
the Tories and Siobhan Bailey. I mean, why are the Tories only flatlining in the polls? Labour's improved a little bit in Scotland at 30%. The SNP, it's still at 42%. The Tories on 18%. If you take everything that's been laid out, Liz has talked about the SNP's record, which I know you would counter, and the investigation into finances, why are you still doing so badly?
Well, listen, I mean, I think if it wasn't so serious, it would be completely fascinating to watch what's going on with the SNP in Scotland. And it's been a one-party state for a long time. And as a unionist and someone who believes passionately in the union, it's great to see the SNP looking like a bit of a busted flush. But I don't think that we should be really concentrating on the politics personally, because the neglect of the health service, the education service up there, the highest drug deaths in Europe, those are the things that need to focus. And I know the Scottish Tories are doing that day in, day out. So I think there is an awful lot of work to do. I don't think Humza Yousaf have to be too worried about his priority speech, because Keir Starmer gives loads of them and nobody remembers them. Rishi's got some very good 5 priorities that everybody does remember. So, but I think in terms of Scotland, we've got to get some very serious action on those high.
Let me come back on that. I mean, you mentioned education. You know, 50% of the people in Scotland have a tertiary education. That, by that measure, is the best educated workforce in Europe.
You need to look at the PISA list.
This is actually really, really important. But back to the issue of money.
But hang on, just on the education, I will come back to the money. But let's just be clear with our viewers. Scotland has actually slipped down the PISA tables over a period of years, and that was very much the metric that Nicola Sturgeon used to swear by.
If you look at the PISA metrics, particularly I think it's in English, Scotland went up and then came down. England went up slightly.
Fine.
They both
but by
started off in broadly
they
the same
came down.
place, and they're both about the same place today. But in terms of the
They've
money,
declined.
I asked Liz Kendall a question. Let me ask you a question, Siobhan. I mean, again, it was within the last year. I think Open Democracy were reporting there was £3.5 million of Tory spending from 2019, which no one could identify what it was spent on. Why on? So you explain today, what was the £3.5 million actually spent on?
I think, given the focus on the SNP, you do well to answer some quite serious questions at the moment and just be really honest.
And the £3.5 million, what happened to it?
Deflecting
what was it spent
is
on?
not going to serve you well, and people can see what's going on.
Right. Well, let's go back to the finances and the state of the SNP. Harry, is this just deflection by Stuart Hosey when it comes to the questions that he may legitimately be pointing out about the other parties?
As charming as Stuart is, that was a masterclass in deflection. And there's a reason that I think there's a sort of wry smile in Westminster at what's happening in Holyrood now. It's because the SNP have been the people that have been the boy pointing at the Emperor's new clothes repeatedly. They have been the ones going on the attack. And now there are scenes reminiscent of a Banana Republic up there in terms of having a former leader's house raided, tents erected in the gardens. I mean, if it wasn't for Liz Truss, I think we would describe Nicola Sturgeon's implosion as probably the biggest fall from grace in modern political history. It's an extraordinary turnaround of events. Siobhan mentioned a one-party state and a lack of scrutiny on the SNP. I think there is questions to be answered there about that's not necessarily a criticism of my colleagues in Scotland, but the way the SNP have been so dominant in Scottish politics for the last decade, even more. I think there are serious questions to answer. Yes, this has to be allowed to run its course, but there is very little topspin you can put on your former leader's home being raided by the cops and your former treasurer being arrested. Let's see what happens, but try as you might, Stuart, it's not a great day for the SNP.
Is the party imploding?
No, the party's not imploding. I mean, I checked with my own constituency people this morning.
Still there.
140 new members in the past 2 months. I'm very pleased about that. No, the party is not imploding. Look, I've been honest. This is not a good look. I wouldn't deny that for
it's more than not being a good look, Stuart.
I wouldn't deny that for a single second. Let the police do their job.
Sure.
Let the party put in place all of the mechanisms they need to put in place, and let's get through this problem.
That's, I think, the question, because if it was anyone but the SNP, you would be screaming blue murder. You would be calling for heads to roll before an even knock on the door had happened. Now, I think the problem the SNP have got themselves into is that being pure and whiter than white, allegedly, and being the first ones to call people out and call for action beyond the police and all that, it's letting process take place. that has not been an issue. The SNP have allowed other political parties in this situation to allow them.
What the public will see is, instead of focusing on the issues that matter to them, they are absolutely imploding here. And the facts about their record speak for themselves. And I think people do want to change. And certainly what we are seeing now is that people are beginning to see that the way to get rid of the Conservatives in Westminster and the SNP in Scotland is by voting Labour. In fact, the leader of the Conservatives in Scotland suggested that people should actually vote for the party most likely to get rid of the SNP, and you are starting to see that change in the polls.
How many seats do you think you get in a general election? We know that there have been briefings reported about 20 or more seats from the SNP. Is that what you're looking at?
Well, I would never take any of this for granted. We want to fight for every single seat that we can get. But
is
a
that the
recovery
ballpark?
in Scotland is absolutely essential for a Labour government across the United Kingdom. It has been an absolute priority for us and will remain so. And Anna Sarwar, whose speech yesterday talked about change and the future. That's what the public wants.
We're not seeing it just yet, but as you say, there's a little bit of time to go before the general election. You talk to your constituency office, as you would. Some of your colleagues are pretty shell-shocked, I think, by what's happened. The SNP's deputy Westminster leader, Mhairi Black, has been talking to my colleague Nick Eardley. Let's have a listen.
I mean, if you were going purely by the headlines, it's Armageddon, you know. I think, obviously, there's stuff that's going to need to be clarified and need to have very clear answers for. I'm finding some of these things out as you are, as they're breaking, you know, on the news or being reported online or whatever. So, yeah, no, it's not a great place to be in, but we are where we are, I suppose.
I mean, she sounds pretty resigned, doesn't she? I mean, she's the deputy leader at Westminster. She's finding out online and through news bulletins. I mean, it's just not acceptable, is it, for a party?
Well, hold on. The police are quite rightly not going to tell anyone in advance the actions they're going to take. So I'm going to find out at exactly the same time as you're going to find out. And Mhairi's absolutely right. The substance of what she said, you know, there are changes which have to be made. And I wholly concede that. Humza's already put that in place. The NEC agreed a whole package of measures at the weekend. And that's exactly what we'll do.
All right, you can listen to that programme on BBC Radio 4 tomorrow evening at 8:30, Leading Scotland, where by my colleague Nick Eardley. Just briefly, though, before we move on, we could just show the Daily Record here. Nicola backed in SNP finances row. Humza, I won't suspend Sturgeon. He's defended the former First Minister. Do you think she should be suspended, forced to stand down while all this is going on?
On what grounds?
Well, your colleagues are, opposition MSPs are calling for it just while this probe is going.
Well, they would, wouldn't they?
Right.
No, there's no justification whatsoever for Nicola being suspended from the party. And no, she should not step down pending this. The investigations into whoever the police are investigating will run their course. If people are charged, let's see what happens. If people aren't charged, let's take it from there. But no, she should not be suspended.
So you'd like to see Nicola Sturgeon back in Holyrood,
well, she's
going around her business. There were reports that she was avoiding being seen.
No, there weren't.
There were reports.
The First Minister decided to work from home this week because Humza is making his main first big keynote policy speech. That was a very sensible course of action. I'm sure Nicola will be back at her desk next week.
Let's talk about something else. Fostering, because the children's charity Barnardo's is calling for the government to make employers provide parental leave for foster carers as the number of people choosing to take children out of care falls. Let's just show you a short film from our reporter, Eman Warwick.
Everyone I'm talking to within the fostering sector is saying recruitment has never been this hard. Right now, people are looking at the money and going, I can't afford to do this.
We have lost 12% of foster carers across the sector.
The funding is very good. It was very good initially because it would cover all costs, but since the rises in everything, it can be a bit challenging at the moment.
Christine is a foster carer and her son has additional needs. Because of rising costs, things have been even more challenging.
So he has different dietary needs than I have. He only eats halal food, so that's an additional cost. He has medical needs that are not available on the NHS. You know, he came from a very hot country into, when he arrived, it was quite warm, and then the weather changed drastically. And so the amount that you spend on his clothing changes drastically as well.
Prices have gone up 10% from last year, and everyone is noticing the increases. For foster parents, it's another thing to worry about.
My wife and I, we adopted 3 children initially, then we became foster carers for 2 little girls, who we then were asked to adopt, so we adopted them. And then a few years later, their little sister came along.
Al is a social worker who has worked with adoptive families and foster carers. Lately, he's noticed some changes in the fostering sector.
Everyone I'm talking to within the fostering sector is saying recruitment has never been this hard. It's always been difficult. You know, there's a lot of reasons why people want to foster and a lot of people why people don't foster. But right now people are looking at the money and going, I can't afford to do this.
There is paid leave for adoptive parents. For the first 6 weeks, you get 90% of your weekly pay and support available for up to 33 weeks. But there is nothing similar in place for foster carers.
We have lost 12% of foster carers across the sector who choose to leave fostering due to the impact of COVID, but the cost of living crisis. We would encourage the government to explore further the potential of providing paid leave to both foster carers and adopters, to encourage members of the public to consider fostering adoption, where this may be something that they wish to pursue, but yet their employer doesn't facilitate.
A Department for Education spokesperson has said, "We are increasing the support available through an above-inflation increase to the fostering minimum allowance and changing tax and benefit allowances for most foster carers, meaning an average tax cut of £450 per year." But for Christine, fostering has been life-changing in a positive way.
You know, just seeing the transition in their lives, just seeing, you know, the glow that they have once they start feeling comfortable and safe, and when they start achieving.
Siobhan, do you support the idea of paid parental leave for foster carers as a way of perhaps boosting the number of people that might take it on?
I'm intuitively in favour of looking at all options to support these families. I mean, they look after the most vulnerable and some of the most damaged children in our society, and we know all the evidence shows that without strong support, early intervention, the life chances and the outcomes are pretty poor for these kids. So I think Bernardo is very sensible. It'll be really interesting to look at their report. I mean, Gloucestershire County Council is actually paying their own employees paid fostering leave to encourage parents to take this on. But I also had a really good chat with a very inspirational local foster dad, and he was explaining to me that during the pandemic they did quite a lot of work to do more recruitment. They got really, really high take-ups. People had a bit more time, a bit more thought to get involved. But he was also saying that other foster parents have said about work, their employers tend to try and be flexible, but there's issues, for example, with council appointments with social services, you know, and these are families that will sometimes take on a child for 3 days, a few weeks, a few years, so there could be repeated parental leave. So I think it needs to be thought through carefully to avoid any unintended consequences, but yeah, let's look at see how we can help them.
What do you think of the idea, Liz?
I think that we're actually seeing quite a change here for some of the reasons that have already been discussed, but also because, as I'm told by my own city council, levels of need, the damage that some of the children have experienced are getting higher and higher, and that foster carers are having to do far more, and that is actually often quite hard to do whilst holding down a job. So what I would like to see is a review in the round of what are the levels of need, what support should be provided for foster carers, because they are actually the bedrock of the care system for children. 70% of placements, care placements, are with foster carers, and 9 out of 10 councils are saying that they're having problems. So we will only make commitments, financial commitments, that we can show how we would pay for them. But I actually think if the levels of need of the children are growing, that it's putting a lot more onto those foster carers, we, I think, need to look at as a whole and see what more support is needed in future. I think that's the right approach.
I mean, there are a record number of children in foster care in England, and taking on board what both Siobhan and Liz have said, should foster parents be paid more? Should government be impelling employers to allow the same sort of rights as other parents in terms of parental leave?
I think I would agree with what Siobhan said at the beginning, that instinctively I would want to support that. Now, I'd want to see the detail and the costings and all the rest of it, but instinctively I would want to support that because it ties in with a huge amount of stuff the Scottish Government are doing in terms of the promise to families, young people and people with care experience. Scottish Child Payment, the additional grant funding for people in foster care in Scotland. So we're already going down some of this route. But I think the answer to the question is, if it was affordable, yes, I would like to see that.
Harry?
No, I defer to my elected fellow panellists on this one, who have a sort of day-to-day dealing with local authorities in this. But yeah, on instinct, inflation is biting every single sector. You know, you can pull out any public-facing or even private-facing organisation, and the blight of inflation is the hidden hand in the wallet of inflation is hitting them all. Fingers crossed, touch wood, that does start to come down as predicted.
Well, by the end of the year,
but the damage it has wrought is you'll find that right across the care sector.
We're going to go and talk about low traffic neighbourhoods in just a moment. Before we move on, just briefly on childcare, because it was a big deal made by Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, in the budget. But the Institute for Fiscal Studies and other experts have been giving evidence to the Education Select Committee today about the government's plans. They've raised concerns, the IFS, about the proposal leading to providers leaving the market if the funding is too low. Do you share those concerns?
Yeah, so this was my campaign. I was grateful to see the Chancellor give me a bit of a nod on this. It is really important that we underpin the sector and make sure that the supply side, the workforce is there, and make sure that the sector is strong, because as we add in more subsidised hours, as the demand grows, looking after the parent side of things, I think the sector does need support. I know that Adam Hawkesby from Onward, who I did the report with, is giving evidence today. So there's some really critical thinking. Yeah. I think the Chancellor was right. Throw everything at this to try and make it work.
Are they throwing everything at it? Because the IFS is saying providers could go bust.
So we've got the Select Committees also doing the report and doing it's not for the Treasury to do this kind of work and extra.
It is the government's job to have an actual plan.
But it's the Department for Education are working really hard on that.
Well, my nurseries will say to me that they can't fulfil their existing commitments because they're lacking staff. If you increase the number of people it's available to, the pressure will be too much. This isn't a proper plan.
What would Labour's plan be? Because we still don't have the sort of bones of that.
We absolutely do.
Well,
we have made absolutely clear our commitment around breakfast clubs for every single primary school child as a first step towards a full strategy that gives parents the support.
Which we don't have the detail of.
Which we will come out with further information on. But what we want is not just a headline. There has to be a plan with the staff and the commitments to the extra places and how they're going to be delivered, because we don't want to put the sector further at risk.
Listen, I was pushing Labour to come out with some plans, because they talked about universal free childcare. But
your plans, because you are the government.
Yeah, we definitely need to make sure that the extra money on the hourly rates comes through. It's 30% for the 2-year-olds, but I think there needs to be more. I think we need to look at this again. But ultimately, the supply side work, I think, can be done and can be done quickly, particularly on childminders.
Is it quickly? Because it's not going to happen anyway till 2025. I mean, it's
no, that's the additional hours. So this work can be done. So
getting the additional hours, we're having to wait a long time, aren't we?
Well, I mean, again, I think that can be done quickly if we do this stimulating the workforce, which is and the businesses. But I think childminders is a really interesting part of this mix. So I think focus on them would be.
All right, we'll come back to this again, because last night on Panorama, BBC climate editor Justin Rowlatt investigated low traffic neighbourhoods. Now, these involve restricting roads in a variety of ways in local communities to virtually all through traffic. They're funded by the government as part of a £3 billion or so active travel policy, and the aim is that half of all trips in England's towns and cities will be walked, cycled or made in a wheelchair by 2030. The schemes have been dividing communities. Take a look at this.
Do we know where this bollard, which went missing this afternoon, do we have any idea where it is?
we have some idea of where the bollard is.
You've been sent a screenshot, haven't you?
Yes, I've been sent a screenshot by somebody else.
Can you please show it to me?
Okay.
So this is a screenshot, and this shows this street.
Mm-hmm.
I think I know which house it is. I think it's a house over there.
I think it might be, yeah.
There doesn't look like there's anyone in. It's in there. I think what's happened, somebody's posted it through the window.
Well, there is a very clear indication of some of the divisiveness and reaction to low traffic neighbourhoods, this in Oxford. Let's talk to Zahura Plummer, an Oxford resident who's campaigned. You saw her there in favour of the city's LTNs, as we call them, as part of a group called Oxfordshire Livable Streets. Why do you think, Zahura, that these schemes have generated so much criticism and division?
I think it's really important to remember that it's a really small minority of people who carry out vandalism like that. So the majority of people are in favour of these schemes. They're just really silent. They don't speak up. We did a YouGov poll, OLS did a YouGov poll, and 2 to 1 are in favour of LTNs. And that's across political spectrums and age ranges and things like that. So most people just keep quiet if they're not in favour, if they are in favour, and a very small minority of people vandalise it.
Right, very small number will probably, you're right, not vandalise or be vandalising bollards or any of the things put up to stop the traffic. But in terms of people being supportive, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence, not just from Oxford but in London, that people are very unhappy. They felt they weren't properly consulted and that they are fragmenting communities.
Yeah, there's also a lot of anecdotal evidence the opposite. I mean, I live the other side of one of the most hated bollard in Britain. I live on the other side of the road, and I was watching all the school children pouring in this morning, walking, cycling, scooting, and they've reduced the number of cars dropping off by 300 journeys per day. And it's extraordinary, the change. People are dusting off their bikes. I went to the bike shop and they said business is just booming. And people come in, the customers come in and say, well, because of the LTNs, I've dug my bike out. So there's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence both ways. And the media tends to focus on the division and how, terrible it is. But actually, there's a lot of people who are just getting on with things.
Right. I mean, the low traffic neighbourhoods, as they're called, I mean, the idea is to reduce or perhaps shut off traffic altogether using various means of restrictions. We focused, or the panorama certainly focused, on the bollards, the most hated bollard, as you said, in England so far. But Oxford is going to extend one of its schemes to shut down through traffic on some central main roads. Now, this is going to make car journeys longer, and won't that increase emissions?
It doesn't increase emissions overall, because what it does is it really speeds up buses. So that's the main reason we're doing it. So it's not like LTNs across the city. It's quite a different scheme which really allows people to drive who need to drive. So there's a big long list of exemptions. The roads are not closed. There's no physical barriers. There's ANPR cameras, and every Oxford resident has 100 exemptions a year. So for 100 days a year, they can drive through the filters. But even without using one of the free passes, they can get to every part of the city by car without using one of their passes. So it's really different from LTNs, and it really recognises people need to drive, and businesses are exempt, so they'll see their journeys really speeding up.
We're going to bring in the rest of the panel. Harry, your reaction to what Zahura has said in terms of there are plenty of people against, but there are also plenty of people in favour.
I thought it was interesting until right at the last second there, the word business wasn't mentioned by our campaigning friend there. It's not necessarily businesses who are trying to drive around, it's businesses who are having their footfall absolutely hammered by this. Where I live in South East London, local dry cleaners, local shops have noticed that a massive fall in the amount of customers they're getting if they're slightly off the beaten track, if they're on a side road, because then people that can't get there, because a lot of people drive to the shops. And that's just a fact of life. And the fact is, the way this was done is it was what's caused such particular anger. Under the cloak of coronavirus legislation, which was meant to design to protect us and be temporary and used in extreme circumstances, local councils and London Assembly and the government, they are as much to blame for this as anyone else, have allowed these this vast sweeping change to people's lives without consultation that's having a direct effect on small businesses who are already struggling. It is totally unfair, And there'll be, imagine, anecdotal evidence to counteract this. But I can't help but notice where I live, it's the nice, richer streets that have been shut off, and poorer areas are having more cars driven through them because rich people are being protected by this completely unfair, undemocratic government overreach.
Siobhan?
Well, listen, I mean, I think the issue is, well, if you've got one round your house, it seems to be great for people, and in principle they sound great, and air quality is very important, and nobody will disagree with that. But ultimately, if you're stuck on the outskirts, and anyone trying to drive around London, I mean, I have to drive in and out for work with my kids twice a week. It is a disaster to get to our house, and it takes hours longer. And it's also that our construction lads, our people in VADs, they work at very, very tight margins. So it's wrong to say sending them around long routes doesn't have any impact, and also it's wrong. I just can't believe that it doesn't have an impact on the environment as well.
Was the government
with all the
wrong then to fund this thing?
Well, the government funded an active travel policy, and the ideas behind that are things like rural paths, accessibility. Some of my villages have done things, but actually it's down to the councils to make the decisions. And we've got, Labour, we've got the ULEZ thing. I mean, that can spark a absolute massive debate in London, even at the mention of the words. You've got Labour, I think Oxford. The Lib Dems are in a right mess on this because in Cambridge they're pushing a congestion charge, and in London they're against the ULEV scheme. So it is a muddle. But ultimately, let's think about people. I'd like to see some more evidence about the impact, not just in the street that they're in, but actually the wider impact.
Well, Zahura, you're nodding away. What do you think of everything you've heard?
So I think it's worth remembering that since Google Maps and GPS, there's been a lot more rat runs in residential areas. So what we're talking about is kind of balancing how it used to be. So there's been a massive rise in people taking the back streets, which you just didn't used to do. So tradespeople just would have stuck to main roads largely. And now because of Google Maps, that's changing. So it's about rebalancing those back to residential areas. But also I think it's really worth remembering that should be different in different places. So it's fine that it's different in Cambridge to Oxford to London. And that's completely normal.
Liz?
I think it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man or indeed woman to tackle this issue. You've got people who absolutely want and need to drive their cars because they've got kids, bags of shopping, they're working shifts. You've got businesses who want people to come to them.
But it doesn't work then with these low traffic neighbourhoods.
But you've also got people who are desperately worried about the amount of traffic pollution for their kids around schools, local residents furious with the amount of traffic around schools. So we deal with this all the time as MPs.
Answer is?
First of all, two answers. One is there has to be genuine consultation, not just a tick box thing through the back door. But secondly, can I say this? I know it's a longer term issue, but ultimately people will always want to drive their cars. We need to get to electric cars and proper charging that you can trust to bring those emissions down.
In principle, though, do you think they are a good idea?
If they are done with proper consultation and bringing communities together, and if they can work, yes.
Harry?
But they weren't. That's the problem. They're here and they're not going to go away. And, the government can say, oh, then next time we'll consult. But it's too late for hundreds of thousands of people who've had their daily lives, almost ruined by this.
And Zahura, do you accept that there wasn't enough consultation? I don't know, maybe specifically in your area, but certainly in parts of London, which I'm more familiar with, there wasn't the consultation according to local communities.
I can't speak for London, but I know in Oxford there has been lots of consultations, been a lot of opportunities for people pro and against to come and speak to councillors. Councillors have sat down with business people. There's been all kinds of things. And consultation is also not the way that we make policy in this country. Consultation is for refining it. So, for example, carers are now really included in the traffic filter scheme because of consultation. That was a direct outcome. But we don't make policy yes or no based on consultation because we know that the people who fill out consultations are normally people who feel very strongly one way or the other. The majority of people are with it.
Stuart?
I think we need to be careful not to conflate a whole bunch of different issues. Active travel schemes, by and large, tend to be extremely good. The concept of the 15-minute city or the 20-minute community, where you should be able to walk or cycle to most of the things you need in a short space of time, that's a great idea.
10 seconds.
Low emission zones, also good. But to do this, to implement it by putting up bollards or boxes when it's undesirable or nobody wants it, heavens, I'm not sure if that's quite the way to go.
That brings us to the end of the programme. Thank you, Zahura, and all our guests. I'll be back tomorrow.